A door closed quietly in that house, and for several seconds, nobody understood that the person you love had already made a decision they could no longer keep hidden. There was no dramatic entrance, no carefully prepared speech, no attempt to become the center of attention. They simply sat among the people who had known them for years, looked around the room, and carried an expression their family immediately recognized as different. Something had shifted. And what makes this moment so important is that the conversation was never supposed to become about you. It began with ordinary things, plans, responsibilities, expectations, the kind of subjects families move through without realizing that one sentence can suddenly change the direction of an entire evening. Then someone mentioned the future. Another person asked a seemingly harmless question. And the person you love became unusually quiet. Not uncomfortable. Not confused. Quiet in the way someone becomes quiet when they have finally reached the end of an argument they have been having inside themselves for far too long. Don't skip, because the words they eventually spoke were only the surface of what had actually been happening. Their family heard a declaration that evening, but behind that declaration was a private journey involving you that almost nobody in the room fully understood. The strange part was how calmly it happened. Someone across the room asked what they intended to do next, expecting the familiar answer, perhaps even expecting them to laugh the question away. Instead, the person you love lifted their eyes and said something that made every other conversation disappear. "I'm ending my ties with," then they stopped. Just for a moment. And that unfinished sentence created more silence than any raised voice could have created. Their family waited. One person leaned forward. Another searched their face, trying to understand whether this was temporary emotion or something they had been considering seriously. But the person you love wasn't improvising. That was the first realization everyone had. Whatever name, situation, expectation, or connection was about to complete that sentence had already been examined privately many times. This wasn't about rejecting people carelessly. It was about stepping away from a pattern that no longer matched the life they wanted to build. And somehow, quietly, you had become connected to the reason they finally found the courage to say it aloud. Here is what nobody in that room knew. For some time, the person you love had been living between two versions of their future. One version looked sensible from the outside. It kept everyone comfortable. It required few explanations. It allowed them to continue being the person others expected them to be. But the second version was quieter and far more personal. In that future, they stopped choosing according to appearances. They stopped measuring relationships by convenience. They stopped allowing other voices to decide which connections deserved their energy. And whenever they pictured that second future, your presence kept appearing in it. Not because they were creating some perfect fantasy, but because something about their connection with you had forced them to become more honest with themselves. Perhaps that is the part you never saw. While you may have wondered whether they noticed your sincerity, they were privately comparing the peace they associated with you against the pressure they felt elsewhere. Then came the sentence their family wasn't prepared for. The person you love finished what they had started. "I'm ending my ties with the expectations that keep deciding my life for me." The words were gentler than everyone feared, yet somehow more powerful. Because suddenly the conversation wasn't about one individual. It was about every arrangement, every assumption, every unspoken obligation that had kept them moving in directions they had never consciously chosen. Someone asked what had changed. They looked down for a second. And although they didn't immediately say your name, the answer they gave brought you closer to the center of the conversation than anyone realized. They said, "I finally understood that keeping everyone comfortable can sometimes mean losing your own voice." Stay till the end, because what happened after that sentence revealed why this decision had become connected to you. Their family reacted in different ways. One person seemed surprised but thoughtful. Another wanted clarification. Someone else remained completely silent, perhaps because they had already noticed the change developing. Yet the person you love did something unexpected. They didn't defend themselves aggressively. They didn't blame anyone. They simply explained. They spoke about how exhausting it had become to carry relationships, expectations, and old commitments simply because walking away from them might disappoint somebody. They admitted that they had spent too much time trying to become understandable to everyone. And then they said something that changed the atmosphere again: "There is someone who never asked me to perform." The room became still. Now they were talking about a person. Now everyone knew there was another layer. Your name still wasn't spoken. Not yet. But one family member immediately understood. That person had seen the difference before. They had noticed how the person you love became more reflective whenever you were mentioned. They had noticed the unusual pauses, the way certain conversations suddenly became serious, the way your name carried a weight that ordinary names didn't seem to carry. And rather than exposing this immediately, that family member asked a simple question: "Is this about the person you've been thinking about?" For perhaps the first time that evening, the person you love smiled. Not widely. Just enough to reveal that the question had reached somewhere private. There are moments when an answer arrives before someone speaks. This was one of them. They didn't deny it. And that mattered. Because there may have been a time when they would have changed the subject. There may have been a time when they would have protected their feelings by pretending nothing significant existed. But this time, they remained where they were. They allowed the silence to say what they were not ready to say directly. Then they answered, partly. That single word opened another door. Partly. Why only partly? Because you were not the reason they wanted to abandon their life. You had become part of the reason they wanted to live it more truthfully. There is a difference, and the person you love understood it. They weren't trying to place responsibility for their choices on you. They were recognizing that meeting someone who made authenticity feel natural had exposed how many other areas of their life were built around obligation rather than genuine alignment. Something important is waiting for you, because this is where their family began asking questions about you, and the answers were nothing like the conversation they expected to have that evening. Someone asked, "What is different about this person?" The person you love hesitated. Not because they lacked an answer. Because they had too many. How do you explain someone who changed your thinking without deliberately trying to change you? How do you describe a connection that didn't arrive with fireworks, promises, or grand declarations, yet somehow stayed in your mind during quiet moments. They could have described your appearance. They could have mentioned your personality. They could have chosen something simple. Instead, they said, around them, I notice who I actually am. Read that feeling carefully. They didn't say you completed them. They didn't say everything suddenly became perfect. Their words were far more grounded and, perhaps because of that, far more meaningful. They explained that being connected to you made them question why they had tolerated certain patterns. Why they had remained attached to situations simply because they were familiar. Why they had allowed other people's expectations to become louder than their own judgment. And then came another revelation. They admitted that for a while, they had actually tried to distance themselves from what they felt about you. That surprised the room. One person asked why. The person you love gave an answer you may need to hear, because it felt easier than changing everything else. There it was. The missing piece. Perhaps you once interpreted their distance as indifference. Perhaps there were moments when their silence made you wonder whether the connection mattered only to you. Perhaps you noticed them pulling back precisely when things seemed to become meaningful. Their family was now discovering that the opposite may have been happening. Sometimes distance appears not because someone feels nothing, but because acknowledging what they feel would require them to examine everything surrounding it. The person you love had been doing exactly that. But the evening still had another turn waiting. A family member who had barely spoken finally asked, "So what exactly are you ending?" This time, the person you love didn't answer immediately. They stood up, walked toward the window, and stared outside as though they needed a few seconds without anyone's eyes directly on them. What they said next was quiet enough that everyone had to listen carefully. I'm ending my habit of keeping connections alive just because I'm afraid of disappointing people. Notice the wording. Connections. Plural. Their family understood immediately that this was larger than one relationship. There were old friendships maintained out of obligation. Commitments that no longer reflected who they were becoming. Expectations about how their future should look. Perhaps even one particular connection their family had assumed would remain important indefinitely. The person you love wasn't declaring war on their past. They were creating boundaries around their future. And then your name finally entered the room. Not from them. From someone else. A relative asked directly, "And where does your name fit into all of this?" Everything changed. For the first time, the person you love looked genuinely caught off guard. Not upset. Simply exposed in the gentle way people sometimes feel when somebody says aloud what they have been protecting privately. They turned from the window. Their expression softened. And before answering, they asked something nobody expected. "How did you know?" The response came almost immediately. "Because you become different when that person is mentioned." The person you love laughed quietly, but there was nowhere left to hide. And maybe this is the part that would surprise you most. Their family had been observing more than they had been saying. They had noticed the subtle shift. They had noticed that whenever conversations about relationships became superficial, the person you love seemed less interested than before. They had noticed that their standards had changed. They were no longer impressed by appearances alone. They had started speaking more about peace, honesty, consistency, and being understood. Someone in that family had quietly connected those changes with the period when you became important to them. Yet nobody knew what they intended to do about it. Until that night. The person you love returned to their seat and finally spoke without hiding behind vague language. "I don't know exactly what happens next with us," they admitted. "But I know I don't want to keep making choices that guarantee nothing meaningful can happen." That sentence deserves a moment. They weren't making impossible promises. They weren't pretending the future was already written. They were doing something more mature, creating space for truth. And perhaps that is why the conversation became so emotional without becoming dramatic. Their family wasn't watching someone impulsively throw their life away. They were watching someone finally separate what they genuinely wanted from what they had inherited as expectation. One relative asked whether you knew any of this. The person you love shook their head. "No." Another question followed. "Are you going to tell them?" Silence. A long one. Then came an answer that nobody expected. "I want to. But there's something I need to make right first." Something. Those words shifted the entire conversation again. What could they possibly need to make right before approaching you? Their family wanted to know too. But the person you love refused to explain immediately. They simply said there had been moments when they had allowed uncertainty to influence how they treated the connection. Times when they could have communicated but chose silence. Times when they expected you to understand feelings they had never clearly expressed. Times when they pulled away and hoped distance would somehow solve what honesty might have solved much sooner. And suddenly, their decision to end certain ties made deeper sense. They weren't clearing people out of their life to chase you. They were clearing confusion out of themselves before speaking to you. That distinction mattered. One family member nodded slowly and said, "Then don't approach them with another mystery." The person you love looked up. "What do you mean?" "If they matter, be clear." Four simple words. Be clear. Something about those words stayed with them. Because clarity was exactly what had been missing. You may have received fragments when you deserved sentences. You may have seen hints when you needed honesty. You may have felt warmth followed by unexplained distance. And although nobody in that room knew your entire side of the story, they understood one basic truth: meaningful connections cannot survive forever on assumptions. The person you love understood it too. Then something unexpectedly beautiful happened. Instead of the family opposing them, one person asked what they actually wanted. Not what everyone else wanted for them, not what seemed convenient, not what would look easiest from outside. "What do you want?" The person you love became completely still. That question was harder than all the others. Because when someone has spent years considering everybody else, being asked about their own desire can feel strangely unfamiliar. They thought carefully. Then they said, "I want one honest conversation with them. Not a perfect ending. Not a guaranteed beginning. A conversation." And somehow, that modest answer carried more emotional weight than any dramatic promise could have carried. They wanted the opportunity to tell you what had really been happening behind the silence. They wanted you to know why they had stepped back. They wanted to explain which pressures they had been carrying. They wanted to acknowledge the moments they could have handled differently. Most importantly, they wanted to hear your truth too. Because this story was never supposed to become one person deciding everything. Your voice mattered. Your boundaries mattered. Your experience mattered. And the person you love was beginning to understand that loving someone, or simply caring deeply about them, doesn't mean deciding their response in advance. It means showing up honestly and allowing them the dignity of choosing what happens next. But wait. The conversation didn't end there. As everyone began processing what had been said, one family member revealed something they had never previously told the person you love. They had spoken about you before. Not recently. Much earlier. The person you love stared at them. When? The relative mentioned a moment from the past, a day when your name had unexpectedly entered another family conversation. Apparently, someone had asked about you then, too. And the relative had noticed something remarkable about the person you love even at that early stage. They remembered exactly how their expression changed. They remembered the sudden softness. They remembered how quickly they tried to act normal afterward. And then the relative said, "I knew before you did." The room filled with quiet laughter. Even the person you love smiled. For the first time that evening, the tension softened. But underneath that lighter moment was a realization they couldn't ignore. Perhaps their feelings had been visible for much longer than they imagined. Perhaps they had hidden them successfully from only one person. You. And that thought landed differently. They became quiet again. Because if everyone else could sense what mattered, why had you been left trying to interpret silence? That was the moment their decision became more specific. They reached for their phone. Someone noticed. "Are you messaging them?" "No," they said. "Not yet." They opened something they had written earlier. A message. Unsent. Their family didn't see the words, but the person you love had apparently drafted it days before. They had written, deleted, rewritten, and saved it without sending. Not because it contained some enormous secret, but because pressing send would make everything real. And here is where the evening moved toward the revelation that still hasn't fully unfolded. One relative asked, "What does the message say?" The person you love looked at the screen. Then locked the phone. They weren't ready to read it aloud. But they revealed the first line. Only the first line. "I owe you the truth about why I disappeared when I actually wanted to come closer." The room went silent again. And somewhere inside that sentence may be the answer to questions you stopped asking because you assumed no answer was coming. Don't skip the meaning hidden here. The person you love wasn't preparing a grand performance. They were preparing accountability. They were recognizing that feelings alone do not repair confusion. Words must eventually meet actions. Intentions must become communication. And whatever happens between two people afterward should grow from reality rather than imagination. Yet there was still one unresolved piece. The unfinished part of the bombshell. Because although they had explained that they were ending their ties with old expectations and obligation-driven connections, there was one specific tie they still had not named. Their family knew it. They knew it. And deep inside, perhaps they had entered that room knowing they could no longer avoid saying it. Someone asked one final question. Is there one particular connection you're walking away from? The person you love looked across the room. Their expression changed. The softness remained, but now there was certainty behind it. Yes. Nobody interrupted. Who? They took a breath. And instead of giving the name immediately, they said something that revealed why this decision had taken so long. It's someone everyone assumed would always be part of my future. That answer stunned the room, not because anyone was angry, but because suddenly several pieces of the past began fitting together. The expectations. The hesitation. The pressure. The reason the person you love had struggled to speak freely about you. The reason they had occasionally seemed trapped between what they felt and what they believed they were supposed to choose. Their family exchanged glances. One person clearly knew exactly who they meant. Another whispered, "Are you sure?" And the person you love gave the calmest answer of the entire evening. "I'm sure that pretending is unfair to everyone." No attack. No accusation. No dramatic rejection. Just truth. Because maintaining a connection without genuine intention can eventually become unfair to both people involved. The person you love had finally recognized that keeping one door half open out of obligation was preventing them from approaching any other door honestly, including the one that might lead toward you. But they also understood something important. Ending that old tie did not automatically give them a place in your life. They would still have to speak with you. They would still have to listen. They would still have to accept whatever you genuinely felt. And strangely, that realization didn't frighten them as much as it once had. Because for the first time, they were no longer trying to control the ending. They were trying to become honest enough for a real beginning to be possible. The room grew quieter as the conversation moved toward its final minutes. People who had initially been surprised were now asking thoughtful questions. One relative reminded them not to rush. Another told them to resolve the old connection respectfully before bringing unfinished complications toward you. And the person you love agreed. That matters. Because what they wanted wasn't chaos. They wanted clarity. They wanted to close one chapter with dignity before asking whether another chapter might still have a page left unwritten. Then someone asked the question that stayed with them after everyone eventually left the room. What if you waited too long? The person you love didn't answer immediately. Perhaps because they had asked themselves the same thing many nights before. What if you had moved emotionally forward? What if your feelings had changed? What if the silence had already taught you to stop waiting? They couldn't know. And they finally understood they had no right to assume. So they said, "Then I'll respect that." But they still deserve the truth. That may have been the most important thing they said all evening. Because whatever happens next, their intention is no longer simply to obtain an outcome from you. It is to give you information you should have had much earlier. The truth about the distance. The truth about the pressure. The truth about why your connection affected them more deeply than they admitted. And the truth about the tie they have finally decided to end. Stay till the end of this journey, because the next part begins with what happened after the family conversation ended. When the house became quiet, the person you love was finally alone, and that unsent message appeared on their screen again. Their thumb hovered over your name. The words were already written. The old tie had finally been named. Their family now knew far more than they had known hours earlier. But just before the person you love could decide whether to send that message, another notification appeared on the screen. They stared at it. Because the name attached to that notification belonged to the very person they had just told their family they were ready to release. And the message contained one question. A question that would force them to prove whether everything they had said inside that room was simply emotion, or the beginning of a decision they were finally prepared to live by.